They all thought she was quiet because she had nothing to say. Her billionaire husband believed it too. In rooms filled with power and applause, he mocked her softly, smiling as if love gave him permission. He thought success made him untouchable. He thought silence meant weakness. But he never asked who she was before him, never wondered what she carried behind her calm. And when the truth finally stood up, it didn't raise its voice. It didn't seek revenge. It simply ended everything he thought he knew. This is not a story about money. It's a story about underestimating the one person who never needed to prove herself. Stay with me, because when truth finally speaks, pride doesn't survive. The room was silent, not the comfortable kind of silence, but the kind that presses against your chest. The kind that makes even powerful men suddenly aware of their own breathing. Julian Crown stood at the head of a long glass conference table, his tailored suit flawless, his posture rigid. Just minutes ago, he had been a billionaire in full control, a man whose signature could move markets, a man people listened to without question. Now, no one spoke. The executives seated around him avoided his eyes. Legal documents lay scattered across the table like quiet accusations. A deal worth billions had collapsed without warning. Funding vanished. Partners withdrew. Banks stopped returning calls. Julian's world wasn't falling apart loudly. It was collapsing in silence. Then the door opened. Elena stepped inside. Calm, composed. The same woman Julian had laughed at, dismissed, and publicly mocked. The same woman he once called simple. The same woman he believed lived in a small world. She took a seat across from him and placed a folder on the table. And with one sentence, everything changed. "The funding you lost," she said gently, "was mine." In that moment, the truth landed like weight on his chest. The woman he mocked was the one who controlled everything. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever been mocked by the very person who promised to love you, protect you, stand beside you, only to make you feel small instead? Have you ever sat quietly in a room, knowing you were capable of more, while someone else mistook your silence for weakness? If you have, this story is for you. Welcome to Lord of Hearts, where we don't just tell stories, we reveal truths about love, pride, and the quiet strength most people overlook. And before we go any further, let me ask you this. If you believe that quiet strength is real, go ahead and like this video. If you've ever been underestimated, comment below, "I have." And if you're drawn to powerful love stories filled with life lessons, subscribe, because this channel was made for hearts like yours. Now listen closely. This story isn't about money, it's about ego. It's about what happens when power enters a relationship and respect quietly leaves. When one voice grows louder and the other slowly disappears. When confidence turns into control and love turns into a stage for mockery. Julian believed success made him superior. He believed providing meant leading. He believed silence meant submission. He believed love meant being admired, not being accountable. And Elena? Elena believed in patience. She believed love meant understanding. She believed standing beside someone meant letting them shine, even if it meant standing in the shadows herself. But what happens when patience turns into invisibility? What happens when the person you trust begins to belittle you in rooms full of strangers? When jokes cut deeper than arguments? When respect is replaced with applause from people who don't know your heart? This is the danger of ego in relationships. Not shouting, not anger, but quiet dismissal. The kind that slowly convinces someone they don't matter. Julian never raised his voice at Elena. He didn't need to. His laughter did the damage. And Elena never defended herself. Not because she couldn't, but because she believed truth didn't need to fight. But here's the thing no one tells you. Truth may be quiet, but it's patient. And when it finally speaks, it changes everything. So, stay with me, because as this story unfolds, you'll witness a love built on admiration turn into something fragile. You'll see how pride can blind even the most successful man, And you'll discover what happens when a woman who's been underestimated for far too long finally stops shrinking. What happens when the truth finally speaks? And more importantly, will love survive once pride collapses? Let's begin. People in Crestwood Hills noticed Elena Hartwell, but they never really saw her. They saw her walking the same quiet streets lined with towering gates and polished hedges. They saw her step out of a modest car among rows of luxury vehicles. They saw her soft sweaters, neutral colors, hair often pulled back in a way that favored comfort over attention, and they whispered. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough. She doesn't dress like she belongs here. She must be very lucky. Imagine being married to a man like Julian and choosing to live so simply. What they didn't see was intention. Elena didn't live simply because she had to. She lived simply because she chose to. Each morning, while Crestwood Hills slowly woke behind tinted windows and guarded entrances, Elena followed a quiet routine. She rose early, brewed her coffee by hand, and stood near the window as sunlight crept across the floor. Those moments mattered to her, the stillness before the world demanded anything. Julian was usually gone by then. Meetings, flights, calls that never seemed to end. Elena never complained. She filled her days with small, meaningful things, volunteering at community centers, sitting with elderly neighbors who rarely had visitors, reading in quiet cafes where no one knew her last name. She remembered birthdays. She listened when people spoke. She noticed details others rushed past. That was her strength. But strength, when it's quiet, often goes unnoticed. In public, Elena rarely spoke unless spoken to. She didn't interrupt. She didn't compete for attention. At dinners filled with confident voices and polished laughter, she listened more than she talked. Some mistook that for insecurity. It wasn't. Elena simply believed words mattered more when they were chosen carefully. There was a softness about her, yes, but beneath it lived a steady resolve, the kind shaped not by praise but by responsibility. She had been raised by a grandmother who taught her that power should feel like shelter, not noise. And so Elena carried herself like a home, warm, calm, open, never realizing how. Many people walked past without noticing the strength holding it together. At home, the contrast was unmistakable. Julian's world was sharp lines and glowing screens, calls taken at odd hours, conversations about margins, leverage, dominance. He moved fast, spoke faster, and lived as though stillness were a waste of time. Elena moved differently. She cooked meals slowly, letting aromas fill the space. She believed food tasted better when prepared with care. She believed evenings deserved conversation, not distraction. She believed connection required presence. Sometimes, when Julian returned late, she would already be asleep. Other nights she waited, book in hand, lamp glowing softly, hoping for a moment of shared quiet. Often, that moment never came. Still, she never accused him, never raised her voice, never demanded. She loved him the way she loved everything else, with patience. But patience has a cost. In rooms full of people, Elena became an afterthought. Julian spoke for them both, decided for them both, laughed for them both. And with each passing event, Elena felt herself becoming smaller, not because she was weak, but because she was choosing peace over conflict. What no one understood was that Elena's silence was never emptiness. It was restraint. Inside her lived memories, values, and a depth shaped by responsibility most people her age never carried. She understood loss. She understood legacy. She understood what it meant to hold something precious without showing it off. And sometimes, late at night, when the house finally fell quiet, Elena allowed herself to feel the ache she hid during the day. She missed the man Julian used to be, the one who listened, the one who asked questions, the one who once admired her thoughts instead of dismissing them. She wondered when admiration had turned into amusement, and yet, even then, she still believed in him. She believed people could lose themselves and find their way back. She believed love meant staying longer than comfort allowed. She believed silence could be a form of loyalty. But here's the truth. Most people never learn. Quiet people aren't weak. They're observant. They notice shifts in tone, subtle dismissals, moments when respect quietly exits a room. They feel the change long before others do, but they don't announce it. They wait. Elena waited. She waited because she loved deeply, because she hoped patiently, because she trusted that kindness, given enough time, would be returned. But while Crestwood Hills whispered and Julian mistook calm for compliance, Elena was becoming something else entirely, not louder, stronger, and the world had no idea what it had overlooked. Not yet. Julian Crown didn't grow up powerful. That part mattered, because it explained everything that came after. Long before penthouses and black cars, Julian learned early that attention followed achievement. He was sharp, driven, and restless, in a way that made teachers notice and competitors uneasy. While others dreamed, Julian planned. While others hesitated, he moved. Winning became his language. By his late 20s, he was already closing deals that made older men uneasy. He spoke with confidence, dressed with precision, and walked into rooms like he belonged there, even when he didn't yet. That confidence opened doors. And when doors opened, Julian walked through without looking back. Success came fast, too fast. Every win fed something inside him. Investors praised his instincts. Media outlets admired his discipline. Colleagues spoke his name with admiration. Each compliment reinforced a quiet belief forming beneath the surface. If I win, I'm right. Money followed. Influence followed. Respect, at least the visible kind, followed. And with it came authority. Julian began to see leadership not as responsibility, but as control. Decisions were his to make because he had earned them. Voices mattered when they agreed with him. Silence to him meant acceptance. He didn't become cruel. He became certain. That was the danger. When Julian met Elena, she entered his life at a moment when success hadn't yet hardened him. He admired her calm, her balance, her ability to slow him down. She grounded him, and for a while that grounding felt like love. But as his world expanded, hers stayed intentionally small. That difference began to bother him. Julian couldn't understand choosing simplicity when abundance was available. He couldn't understand contentment without ambition. To him, growth meant more influence, more recognition, more proof that he was ahead. And slowly, without noticing, Julian began to believe that providing meant leading, and leading meant deciding. He started to measure worth through outcomes. Who earned more? Who spoke louder? Who commanded attention? In that equation, Elena didn't compete because she never wanted to. Julian mistook that as imbalance. In rooms filled with people eager for his approval, his confidence grew sharper. Jokes landed easier. Laughter followed him. When he spoke, others listened. That kind of reinforcement changes how a man sees himself. It convinces him he is always the center. So when Elena stayed quiet during conversations, Julian didn't see restraint. He saw absence. He forgot that strength doesn't always announce itself. He forgot that partnership requires curiosity, not comparison. He forgot that love is not measured in victories. At home, his habits shifted. Conversations became updates instead of exchanges. Plans became decisions instead of discussions. He spoke about their life as though it were another project he managed well. And the more the world praised him, the less he questioned himself. Julian didn't wake up one day and decide to diminish his wife. He simply stopped noticing her. That's how ego works. It doesn't attack loudly. It overlooks quietly. And here's the truth most people miss. Success doesn't always change people. Sometimes, it removes the need for humility. Julian began to believe money validated his perspective. That outcomes justified behavior. That intention mattered more than impact. If he didn't mean to hurt Elena, then surely she shouldn't feel hurt. That belief made him comfortable. Too comfortable. Now pause here for a moment. Let me ask you, honestly, Do you think success reveals character, or does it change it? I want you to comment below and tell me what you believe. There's no wrong answer, only real ones. And if this story is already making you reflect, take a second to like the video. It helps more than you realize. And if you're drawn to stories that explore love, power, and human nature, subscribe to Lord of Hearts. You're exactly where you belong. Back to Julian. The problem wasn't that he worked hard. The problem wasn't that he succeeded. The problem was that he started to believe success entitled him to be unchallenged. He assumed leadership without listening, confidence without reflection, authority without accountability. And, the irony, the woman he underestimated was the one person who never tried to compete with him, because she didn't need to. Julian stood tall in rooms full of applause, unaware that the foundation beneath him was fragile, built not on partnership, but on assumption, not on respect, but on hierarchy. And when that foundation finally cracked, he would realize something far too late. Power can build a man, but without humility, it can also blind him. And Julian Crown was walking straight toward that moment, without seeing it coming. Before wealth gave Julian Crown a title, before his name carried weight in rooms full of ambition, there was a version of him that few people ever knew. A version without certainty. A version still learning who he wanted to become. That was the man Elena Hartwell met. They crossed paths in a coastal town that rarely made headlines. The buildings were worn, the sidewalks uneven, the community overlooked, by developers who didn't see profit in fixing what was broken. That year, a small non-profit organized a renovation project, part charity, part hope, aimed at restoring homes for families who had been forgotten. Julian joined for visibility. At least, that's what he told himself. He was early in his career then, hungry but not yet hardened. The project was supposed to look good on paper, proof that he cared about more than numbers. A few days of showing up, shaking hands, taking photos, then moving on. That plan changed the moment he noticed Elena. She wasn't directing volunteers or leading meetings. She wasn't trying to stand out. She sat on the front steps of a half-renovated building with a group of children gathered. Around her, listening as one of them explained something with great seriousness. Julian slowed his steps without realizing why. Elena didn't interrupt the child. She didn't rush him. She nodded gently, asked questions that showed she was truly listening. When the child finished, she smiled. Not the polite kind, but the kind that makes someone feel heard. Julian had seen confidence before. He hadn't seen presence like that. Others noticed him when he arrived. Some smiled too brightly, others spoke too eagerly. Elena didn't look up right away. She was too focused on the moment in front of her. That caught his attention more than anything else could have. Later that afternoon, Julian found himself nearby again. He offered help, asked questions, lingered longer than he planned. Elena greeted him kindly, without curiosity about his background or ambition. She asked where he was from, what drew him to the project, what he hoped would come from it. No one had asked him questions like that in a long time. As the days passed, they talked more. They spoke while painting walls, while sorting supplies, while sitting on the edge of the pier as the sun lowered itself into the water. Their conversations weren't rushed. Silence slipped between sentences without discomfort. Elena spoke about purpose, not as a concept, but as something lived daily. She believed that improving one small corner of the world mattered, even if no one noticed. She believed consistency mattered more than recognition. Julian listened. He found himself sharing things he rarely voiced. His uncertainty, his drive, his fear of becoming invisible. He admitted he wanted to build something lasting, something that proved he was more than potential. Elena didn't judge that desire. She simply asked, "And who do you want to be while you're building it?" That question stayed with him. At night, after the volunteers left, they sat together under quiet skies, their shoulders close but not touching. Their conversations softened. Dreams were shared without expectation. Julian spoke of success, yes, but also of freedom, of security, of proving to himself that he could rise beyond his beginnings. Elena spoke of community, of belonging, of making space for people who were rarely invited to the table. They didn't argue about their differences, they respected them. There was a gentleness to their connection. No urgency, no performance, just understanding growing slowly, naturally. Julian admired her calm. Elena admired his fire. Where he moved forward, she anchored. Where she paused, he encouraged. They balanced one another without trying. On the final night of the project, they walked along the shoreline, waves brushing the sand beside them. The air was cool. The world felt smaller, simpler. Julian stopped walking first. He looked at her, not scanning, not evaluating, but truly looking. "I don't want this to end," he said quietly. Elena met his gaze. "Then don't let it," she replied. Their first moment of closeness wasn't dramatic. No rush, no grand declaration. Just two people standing still, aware that something meaningful had taken root. What drew Elena to Julian wasn't his ambition alone. It was his openness. Back then, he listened. He asked questions. He let her speak without interruption. He valued her thoughts, even when they differed from his own. He treated her presence as something to be earned, not assumed. She saw potential in him, but more importantly, she saw willingness. And Julian, for the first time in a long while, felt understood without needing to prove anything. When the project ended, they stayed in touch. Calls turned into visits. Visits turned into shared routines. Distance didn't weaken their bond. It deepened it. They built something slowly. When Julian spoke of his growing career, Elena encouraged him, reminding him not to lose himself in the pursuit. When Elena spoke of her work, Julian listened, even when it didn't align with his world. They laughed easily. They sat in comfortable quiet. They learned each other's rhythms. Julian fell in love with the way Elena paid attention to life. Elena fell in love with the way Julian dreamed without fear. Neither of them knew what success would later demand. Neither of them knew how power would change the shape of their love. But in those early days, before money, before status, before expectations, they were simply two people choosing each other. And that foundation, built on listening, patience, and shared respect, was real. Which is why, when things began to change later, Elena held on longer than she should have. Because she remembered this version of him. The man before the world told him who he was. The wedding was beautiful in a way that felt sincere rather than extravagant. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, settling softly over rows of white chairs. Music drifted gently through the air, not loud enough to overwhelm the moment. Elena stood at the front of the room, hands steady, heart full, eyes searching for Julian as he waited across from her. When their eyes met, he smiled. Not the confident smile the world knew, but the one she remembered from the coast, the one that carried warmth instead of certainty. In that moment, Elena believed, without hesitation, that love would protect them. Their vows were simple, honest. Julian promised partnership. Elena promised patience. They spoke about building a life rooted in trust, not appearances, about choosing each other, even when things became difficult. The room applauded, and for a while, they were happy. The early days of marriage felt like an extension of everything they had built before. Shared mornings, conversations that lingered, quiet evenings spent side by side, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply existing together. Julian was busy, but present, ambitious, but attentive. Elena adjusted to his growing career without resentment. She understood momentum. She supported his long hours, celebrated his wins, reminded him to rest when exhaustion crept into his voice. He appreciated her steadiness. At first, as time passed, Julian's successes came faster. Bigger deals, broader reach, more recognition. His calendar filled. His phone rang constantly. His name carried weight in places Elena never visited. Their home began to feel like a resting place rather than a shared space. Elena noticed the shift quietly. Conversations shortened. Meals became delayed. Plans changed without discussion. Julian spoke about we less often, and I more frequently. Still, Elena didn't complain. She believed marriage required flexibility. She believed phases passed. She believed love meant adjusting when life demanded more. But adjustment, when it only moves in one direction, slowly becomes sacrifice. The comments started small, casual, almost unintentional. "You wouldn't understand. This is business. I'll explain later. It's complicated. Trust me. This decision makes sense." Each statement landed gently, but repeatedly. Elena nodded, even when questions formed in her mind. She told herself it wasn't dismissal, it was efficiency. That Julian didn't mean to exclude her. Yet slowly, she was no longer consulted. Plans were announced, not discussed. Choices were made before she knew there was a choice to be made. Julian spoke with confidence, assuming agreement rather than seeking it. Elena felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest: confusion. She searched for the version of Julian who once asked, "What do you think?" She wondered if she had changed, or if he had. At social gatherings, the shift became clearer. Julian moved easily through conversations, commanding attention, directing discussion. Elena followed a step behind, listening as he spoke about their life with polished certainty. "She keeps me grounded," he'd say with a smile. People laughed, complimented him. Elena smiled too, but something felt off. Grounded sounded less like appreciation and more like placement. At first, she brushed it aside. Then came the jokes. Light at first, said with a grin, met with laughter. "Elena doesn't care much for these things," Julian said once, waving toward an elegant setting. "She prefers the simple life. Another time, she keeps me honest. Wouldn't let me get away with half the things I do." The room laughed again. Elena laughed too. But inside, something tightened. She wasn't embarrassed. She was unseen. Julian didn't notice the difference. He mistook her silence for comfort. At home, emotional distance crept in quietly. Julian was present physically but often elsewhere mentally. Conversations turned practical. Affection became scheduled rather than spontaneous. Elena found herself waiting for pauses in his schedule, waiting for moments of shared attention, waiting for the feeling of being chosen again. She didn't articulate it. Instead, she adjusted. She spoke less, asked fewer questions, smiled more often to keep the peace. She convinced herself that being low maintenance was kindness, but kindness without reciprocity becomes erasure. Elena began to shrink in ways she didn't immediately recognize. Not outwardly, not dramatically, internally. She stopped offering opinions when they differed from Julian's, stopped correcting assumptions, stopped expecting emotional presence during conversations. She told herself she was being understanding. Julian told himself everything was fine. From his perspective, the marriage worked. Elena didn't argue. She didn't demand. She supported him publicly. She handled the home effortlessly. He assumed peace meant happiness. He never asked. The gap between intention and impact widened. Julian believed he was providing, protecting, leading. Elena felt like she was disappearing. And still, she stayed. Because she remembered who he was. Because she believed success had temporarily distracted him. Because she trusted that love, given enough patience, would reappear. But patience can only stretch so far before it begins to fray. One evening, Julian returned late from another long day. Elena had prepared dinner, waiting quietly, hoping to share something meaningful. When he arrived, distracted and tired, he barely noticed. She asked about his day. He answered briefly. She tried again, this time sharing something from hers. He checked his phone mid-sentence. "I'm listening," he said, without looking up. She stopped speaking. That moment lingered longer than any argument could have. Elena went to bed that night, feeling lonelier beside her husband than she ever had alone. Still, she didn't confront him. She told herself tomorrow would be different. But tomorrow came, and then another, and another, and the pattern remained. Julian didn't realize he was losing her, not because she was leaving, but because she was folding inward, adjusting herself to fit into the space he allowed. This is how respect erodes. Not through cruelty, not through confrontation, But through neglect disguised as normalcy, Elena's love didn't vanish. It just went quiet. She began measuring her worth by how little she needed, how easy she was to accommodate, how rarely she disrupted Julian's rhythm. That wasn't love. It was survival. And the saddest part, Julian never noticed. Because when someone stops asking for more, it's easy to believe they need nothing. But silence, when sustained too long, becomes a signal. And Elena was reaching hers, slowly, silently, without realizing how close she was to the edge. The dinners became frequent. Lavish homes, private venues, long tables lined with glassware that caught the light just enough to sparkle. People dressed in confidence and ambition, speaking in voices polished by success. Elena sat beside Julian, always where she was expected to be. She learned the rhythm quickly. Arrive on time, smile softly, listen attentively, laugh when others laughed, appear supportive without demanding attention. At first, she didn't mind. She understood these gatherings weren't for her. They were for Julian's world, his partners, his allies, the people who measured worth through influence and reach. Elena told herself her role was simple: stand beside him, not in front of him. But slowly, the tone shifted. It started with comments that seemed harmless enough. "She keeps me grounded," Julian would say, resting a casual hand on the back of her chair. "Someone has to keep life simple." People smiled approvingly. Elena smiled too. But the word simple echoed longer than it should have. Another evening, someone complimented her quiet nature. Julian laughed lightly. "She doesn't care much for these conversations," he said. "She prefers books and calm spaces." Again, laughter followed. Elena felt heat rise in her chest, not embarrassment, but something closer to loss. She wasn't being described. She was being summarized. Each dinner followed the same pattern. Julian spoke. Others listened. Elena became part of the scenery, present, pleasant, unnecessary. When she did speak, her words were often interrupted, redirected, or brushed aside with ease. Not maliciously, casually. That made it worse. The jokes grew sharper over time. "Elena wouldn't survive my workdays," Julian said once, smiling confidently. "She's too gentle for that pace." Another time, "She reminds me there's more to life than ambition, though I'm not sure I've learned that lesson yet." Laughter filled the room. Elena laughed too. Her smile never faltered. Her posture remained composed. Her voice never trembled. Inside, something cracked quietly. She felt herself slipping further into the background, like an object people acknowledged without curiosity. The woman who once had long conversations under open skies was now a punchline wrapped in charm. Julian never noticed her discomfort. To him, the jokes were affectionate, playful, a way to include her. He didn't realize inclusion without respect feels like erasure. After these dinners, the drive home was always quiet. Julian replayed conversations, proud of how smoothly things went. He spoke about deals, about opportunities, about people impressed by him. Elena listened. Sometimes she wanted to say something, to explain how small she felt, how exposed those jokes made her feel. But each time she considered it, doubt stopped her. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this is normal. Maybe love means not making things uncomfortable. So she stayed quiet. And silence, when repeated, becomes a habit. One night, at a particularly large gathering, the discomfort reached a new height. They were seated at a long table, surrounded by people Julian admired. The conversation turned to ambition, who wanted more, who had sacrificed most, who lived fully. Someone turned to Elena and asked, "And what about you? Do you ever wish for more?" Before she could answer, Julian spoke. "She's happy where she is," he said. "Not everyone needs to chase greatness." The words weren't cruel, but they were final. Elena felt her voice disappear in that moment. She smiled politely, nodded once, and lowered her gaze. Inside, her thoughts were loud. "You didn't ask me. You decided for me. You don't know what I want anymore." But she said nothing, because truth, she believed, didn't need noise. That belief carried her through countless moments. Moments where she swallowed words to protect peace. Moments where she chose restraint over confrontation. Moments where she trusted that love would notice her silence and respond. But silence can also be misunderstood. Julian began to assume Elena didn't mind, that she enjoyed staying out of the spotlight, that her calm meant contentment. He never questioned it, and the people around them took cues from him. If Julian joked about her simplicity, others felt safe doing the same. If Julian spoke over her, others followed. If Julian didn't ask her opinion, neither did they. Elena became invisible in rooms she occupied physically. And invisibility is a particular kind of pain. It doesn't bruise the skin, it wears down the spirit. She began to prepare herself before gatherings, not physically but emotionally. She rehearsed smiles, lowered expectations, reminded herself that these moments were temporary. At home, she returned to quiet routines that once brought comfort. But even there, something had changed. She felt less certain of herself. She questioned whether her values still mattered, whether her voice held weight, whether the woman Julian fell in love with still existed, or if she had been replaced by someone easier to overlook. Julian, meanwhile, grew more comfortable. He liked the version of Elena who didn't challenge him publicly, who didn't complicate conversations, who made his life smoother. He mistook her restraint for agreement. That misunderstanding deepened the divide. The irony was painful. Elena had never been weak. She had simply believed love was worth protecting, even at her own expense. But protecting love shouldn't require self-erasure. One evening, after another, dinner filled with polite laughter and quiet wounds, Elena sat alone in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. She looked the same, but she felt different, smaller, not because anyone forced her to shrink, but because no one noticed when she did. And that realization hurt more than any joke ever could. Now, let me pause the story here for a moment, because this is where many people watching this will feel something deeply. So let me ask you, should Elena have spoken up sooner? Is silence strength? Or is it a form of self-betrayal? I want you to comment below and share your perspective. Your voice matters here. And if this story is stirring something inside you, share it with someone who might see themselves in Elena's quiet struggle. These stories are meant to be felt, not watched alone. Back to Elena. She continued to attend the dinners, continued to smile, continued to support Julian. But something inside her was shifting. Not outwardly, internally. She was no longer shrinking unconsciously. She was becoming aware, and awareness changes everything. Julian had no idea that the woman he spoke for, joked about, and overlooked, was quietly reaching clarity. Not anger. Clarity, and clarity, once reached, does not fade. It waits, and when it finally acts, it does so without raising its voice. There are truths that announce themselves loudly, and then there are truths that wait. Elena's was the second kind. Long before Julian Crown became a man whose name carried weight, before invitations arrived unrequested, and rooms shifted when he entered, Elena had already learned something most people never do. That real power doesn't need to be displayed. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't seek approval. And it never explains itself to feel secure. That lesson came from her grandmother. Elena was raised in a home where success wasn't measured by what could be shown, but by what could be sustained. Her grandmother believed deeply in preparation over performance, in building quietly, in helping without announcing it. She used to say, "If you do something good only to be seen, you haven't done it for the right reason." Elena carried those words with her into adulthood. What few people knew was that her grandmother had built something significant, slowly, deliberately, without spectacle. Over decades, she created a private trust focused on education, housing, and long-term community growth. It wasn't flashy. It didn't carry a recognizable name. It wasn't meant to. It simply worked. When her grandmother passed, responsibility transferred without ceremony to Elena. She didn't inherit indulgence. She inherited stewardship. The trust wasn't designed to elevate her lifestyle. It was structured to operate independently, to protect its mission from ego and impulse. Elena learned early that her role wasn't ownership, it was guardianship. So she lived accordingly. She never spoke about it, never hinted, never used it as leverage or identity. To her, wealth was a tool, not a voice. And when she met Julian, she never considered telling him. Not because she was hiding something, but because she didn't believe love required disclosure of power. She wanted to be chosen for who she was, not what she carried. The prenuptial agreement came early in their engagement. Julian insisted, not unkindly, not aggressively, simply as a practical decision. "I've worked hard for what I've built," he said. "This just keeps things clear." Elena agreed without hesitation. Clarity mattered to her too. Julian skimmed the documents quickly. His legal team had prepared them. His interests were protected. The agreement was thorough, focused entirely on his assets, his future earnings, his control. What he didn't notice was how easily Elena signed. No negotiation, no concern, no questions. That should have stood out. But Julian was too accustomed to being the one with more. The agreement, as written, never asked what Elena brought into the marriage. It never needed to, because Elena never intended to merge those worlds. Her trust existed independently. It wasn't tied to her marriage, her name, or her public life. It didn't require recognition, and it didn't seek partnership. It simply functioned, just like Elena. As Julian's career accelerated, Elena's responsibilities continued quietly. She reviewed reports in private, approved funding requests with careful consideration, spoke with advisors who respected her restraint. She never rushed decisions. She never acted emotionally. She never forgot who the work was meant to serve. Her wealth didn't change her pace. It clarified it. And yet, despite carrying responsibility that dwarfed most of the rooms Julian stood in, Elena never corrected him, never reminded him, never defended herself with facts. Why? Because she didn't want power over him. She wanted partnership. She stayed silent because she believed love thrived best without competition, because she believed revealing the truth would shift the balance in ways she never wanted, because she hoped respect would return without needing proof. She waited for Julian to remember her, not her resources, not her background, but her voice. Each joke he made, each assumption he voiced, each dismissal he offered, Elena felt the truth pressing against her patience. But she didn't release it. Not yet. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint shaped by values. She didn't speak because she didn't need to win. She didn't correct him because she wasn't keeping score. She didn't interrupt his confidence because she believed humility would eventually meet him. But silence, when misunderstood, becomes a mirror. And what it reflected back to Elena wasn't the marriage she hoped for. It was imbalance. She began to see clearly. Julian's behavior wasn't driven by malice. It wasn't even driven by cruelty. It was driven by assumption. He assumed he knew her. Assumed her calm meant contentment. Assumed her lack of reaction meant agreement. Assumed his role as provider defined authority. And assumptions, left unchallenged, become foundations. Elena understood something Julian didn't. That revealing the truth too early would not heal the problem. It would only mask it. If she spoke then, he might apologize out of shock, not understanding. He might adjust behavior without confronting the belief beneath it. She didn't want compliance. She wanted recognition. So she waited. She waited through dinners, through laughter at her expense, through moments where she was spoken for rather than spoken with. Each time, she asked herself the same question, does he see me yet? And each time, the answer remained uncertain. The truth Elena carried wasn't just financial. It was emotional. She understood patience. She understood responsibility. She understood that power reveals character only when tested. And she knew, deep down, that the moment Julian learned the truth would be the moment everything changed. Not because of what she had, but because of what he had failed to notice. She didn't fear that moment. She prepared for it. Not by planning revenge, not by building leverage, but by reaching clarity. She reached a point where her silence no longer protected love. It protected illusion. And Elena had never valued illusion. So when she finally decided to stop shrinking, it wasn't dramatic. It was calm, measured, certain, because the truth she carried didn't need urgency. It had waited long enough. And when it finally emerged, it wouldn't speak to dominate. It would speak to reveal. And revelation, when it comes without anger, leaves no room for denial. Julian believed he was the one holding everything together. He had no idea how much had been held back. Not out of fear, but out of love. There are moments in life that don't arrive with noise. No shouting, no dramatic exits, no raised voices or shattered glass. They arrive softly. And because they are quiet, people underestimate them. The night Julian celebrated his latest victory was meant to be triumphant. Another deal secured. Another confirmation that his instincts were right. Another room filled with people who spoke his name with admiration and certainty. The venue reflected his success perfectly. Crystal lights hung high above polished floors. Tables were arranged with careful symmetry. Every detail had been curated to signal arrival into a class of people who never worried about limits. Elena stood beside him as she always did. Graceful, composed, unassuming. She wore a simple dress, chosen not for impact but for comfort. It moved easily when she walked, didn't demand attention when she entered a room. Her hair was pinned back neatly, her expression calm. People greeted Julian with enthusiasm. Firm handshakes, easy laughter, eyes that lingered just a moment too long, hoping to be remembered. They greeted Elena politely, smiles that didn't quite reach curiosity, nods that carried no questions. She noticed as she always did, and as she always did, she didn't mind. Elena had long stopped needing recognition from strangers. What weighed heavier was something else. Julian's energy had shifted the moment they arrived. He moved through the room with confidence sharpened by applause. He spoke louder, laughed harder. His posture carried the certainty of someone who believed the room existed for him. Elena watched him, not with judgment, but with observation. She had learned to read his moods the way one reads weather patterns. Tonight, he was buoyed by affirmation, surrounded by voices that agreed with him, by people who mirrored back the version of himself he liked most. That version didn't always remember her. Dinner progressed smoothly. Conversations flowed. Glasses were refilled without asking. The air felt light, celebratory. And yet, Elena felt a familiar tightening. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anxiety. It was recognition. She had felt it before. The subtle sense that something small but sharp was approaching. Julian eventually stood, glass in hand. The room quieted. He smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. "I just want to say how grateful I am," he began, voice steady and confident. "This deal didn't come easy, but nothing worthwhile ever does." Polite laughter followed. He thanked his partners, his advisors, his team. Each name earned nods and murmurs of approval. Elena listened, hands folded loosely in front of her. Then Julian turned slightly toward her. "And of course," he continued, smiling, "my wife, Elena. She keeps me grounded, reminds me that there's a world outside of all this." A pause, sometimes a very simple world. The laughter came quickly, not cruel, not roaring, but present. Elena felt it land, not like a blow, like a final weight settling into place. Julian didn't look at her when he said it. He was already scanning the room, already moving forward, already basking in response. That was the moment. Not when he spoke, but when he didn't check her face afterward. Something inside Elena didn't crack. It aligned. She smiled politely, as she always did. She didn't correct him, didn't interrupt, didn't shrink further. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar steadiness, the kind that arrives when uncertainty leaves. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Julian was radiant. Guests congratulated him. Elena moved gracefully through conversations, her tone warm, her presence consistent. No one noticed the shift. That was fitting, because this change wasn't for them. Later that night, the house was quiet. The celebration had ended. The laughter had faded. The echoes of approval had followed Julian home in his posture, his stride, his certainty. He loosened his tie, humming faintly, clearly satisfied. Elena changed into something comfortable and sat on the edge of the bed, her movements unhurried. Julian spoke casually, recounting moments from the evening, reliving the applause. Elena listened. Then she spoke. "You don't respect me." The words were calm. No accusation, no tremor. Julian laughed softly, dismissively. "What are you talking about?" She met his eyes. "I'm serious." He sighed, already impatient. "You're reading into things." It was a joke. Elena nodded slightly. It wasn't the joke, it was the pattern. Julian frowned. "You're being sensitive." "No," she said gently. "I'm being clear." That slowed him. She continued, still calm. "You talk about me as if I'm not in the room. You describe my life as if you understand it better than I do. You present my silence as simplicity." Julian crossed his arms. "I provide for you. I respect you. What more do you want?" The words hung there. Elena didn't react immediately. She considered them. Then she said, "I want to be spoken to with the same seriousness you give strangers." Julian scoffed. "You're overthinking this." And there it was. The dismissal. The final confirmation. Elena stood, not abruptly, just decisively. "I've spent a long time believing patience was enough," she said. "Believing that if I stayed calm, you'd see me eventually." Julian rolled his eyes slightly. "This is exhausting." Elena didn't flinch. "That's the problem," she replied. "You're tired of listening, but I'm tired of being small." That caught his attention. She took a breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the moment. "I'm not asking you to change tonight," she said. "I'm telling you that I won't continue like this." Julian stared at her. "So, what? You're threatening to leave?" "No," Elena said softly. "I'm setting a boundary." He laughed again, but there was less certainty in it this time. "And what does that look like?" "It looks like me no longer shrinking to fit your comfort." She walked toward the door, then paused. "You can decide what to do with that." She didn't wait for an answer. That night, Elena didn't sleep, not because she was upset, but because she felt awake in a way she hadn't in years. She thought about the woman she had been before the marriage, the one who spoke with confidence, not volume, the one who trusted her instincts, the one who knew her worth without measuring it against someone else's achievements. She realized something important. She hadn't lost herself. She had been holding herself back, out of hope, out of love, out of belief. And belief, when it meets reality without adjustment, becomes self-erasure. Elena understood now that silence is only powerful when it is chosen, not when it is endured. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was resolved. The next morning, Julian tried to act as if nothing had happened. Casual conversation, familiar routines. Elena matched his tone, but not his assumptions. She moved differently, spoke when she wanted, paused when she chose, no longer filled gaps to make him comfortable. Julian noticed. He didn't understand it yet, but he felt it. And for the first time, Elena didn't rush to explain herself, because explanation had never been the issue. Respect was. She had reached the point where shrinking felt heavier than standing still, and standing still, fully, quietly, without apology, was no longer optional. This was the breaking point, not the end, but the end of endurance, the beginning of truth. Julian had always believed collapse would feel dramatic. Alarms, raised voices, urgent calls stacking on top of each other. He imagined chaos. Instead, it arrived politely. It began with silence. The first sign came early in the morning, when his phone remained still longer than usual. No updates from his team. No congratulatory messages following the announcement of his expansion plans. By mid-morning, the stillness felt wrong. Julian sat at his desk scrolling through emails that should have been there, but weren't. He refreshed his inbox once. Then again, nothing. When his assistant finally knocked, her tone was careful. "There's been a change," she said. Julian didn't look up. Be specific. She hesitated. The funding confirmation from Northbridge hasn't come through. That caught his attention. Northbridge didn't miss confirmations. Julian straightened. They confirmed verbally. Yes, she replied. But they've asked to delay the paperwork. Julian frowned. Delay? Why? They didn't say. A small irritation stirred, but nothing more. Delays happened. He waved her off. An hour later, another message arrived. Then another, a partner requesting a meeting. A lender asking for clarification. A scheduled call quietly removed from his calendar. The pattern formed slowly enough to be confusing, but clearly enough to unsettle him. By noon, Julian stood in the conference room of his own firm, surrounded by faces that no longer looked certain. One executive spoke carefully. 3 firms have paused involvement. Paused, Julian repeated. That's not a word. They're either in or out. They're reconsidering. Julian felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. Reconsidering what? No one's saying. Silence followed. Julian looked around the room. These were people who usually spoke confidently. Today, they avoided eye contact. Set up calls, Julian said sharply. Now, they tried. No one answered. By late afternoon, reality pressed closer. Funding withdrawn. Projects halted. Agreements suddenly conditional. Julian sat alone in his office, staring out at the city he once felt he owned. This didn't make sense. His numbers were solid, his reputation strong, his influence wide. He hadn't lost anything. So why did it feel like everything was slipping? When Elena walked in that evening, Julian barely noticed at first. She closed the door quietly behind her. You wanted to see me? She asked. Julian exhaled sharply. Not now. She didn't move. Elena. I know, she said gently. This will matter. He looked up, irritation giving way to confusion. She stood opposite him, calm as ever. No concern in her posture, no urgency in her voice. You seem surprised, she said. Of course I'm surprised. Julian snapped. This doesn't happen to me. Elena nodded slightly. It doesn't happen to people who assume control. That stung. Julian stood. What are you talking about? She gestured to the chair across from him. Please, sit. He didn't want to, but he did. Elena placed a folder on the table between them, thick, organized. What is this? He asked. Clarity. Julian scoffed. I don't need clarity. I need answers. She opened the folder calmly. The housing initiative that withdrew this morning, she said, is funded through a trust. Julian froze slightly. So, I oversee that trust. He frowned. You volunteer with housing programs. That's not the same thing. It is, she replied softly. When you understand how they're structured. She turned a page. The 3 firms that paused involvement. 2 are subsidiaries of companies I hold controlling interests in. Julian stared at the papers. That's not possible, he said. Elena met his gaze. It is. The room felt smaller. Julian laughed, but it sounded hollow. You're saying this like it's normal. It is, she said. For me. He stood abruptly. You're joking. I'm not. Julian shook his head. You don't have that kind of influence. Elena remained still. You never asked. The words landed heavier than anything else she had said. Julian felt his confidence slip, not collapse but loosen. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you had the power to stop this deal? Yes. And you did? Yes. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian searched her face for triumph. There was none. No satisfaction, no resentment, no edge, only calm. Why? He asked finally. Elena folded her hands. Because you needed to see something. Julian's voice cracked slightly. See what? That the world you think you built alone was never isolated from the one you ignored. He sank back into his chair. You let me walk into this, he said quietly. I didn't, Elena replied. I stayed silent while you spoke for both of us. He swallowed. For years, she continued, You assumed my quiet meant dependence, that my simplicity meant absence of depth. Julian felt a pressure in his chest he couldn't name. You mocked me, she said, not accusing, stating, not loudly, not cruelly, but consistently. Julian covered his face briefly with his hands. When I asked for respect, she continued, you dismissed it. He looked up, eyes unsettled. I never wanted control over you, Elena said. I wanted partnership. His voice was barely audible. Why didn't you tell me? She considered the question. Because if I had, she said, you would have respected the power, not the person. That was the moment his ego finally collapsed. Not shattered, collapsed, folded inward under the weight of recognition. Julian realized something terrifying. He hadn't loved Elena as an equal. He had loved the version of her that made him feel large. And in doing so, he had made himself small. I didn't know, he whispered. You didn't want to, she replied gently. Tears threatened, but Elena didn't look away. I stayed, she said, because I believed you were more than what success turned you into. Julian nodded slowly. And now, she said, you have to decide who you are without applause. The truth didn't crush him because of money. It crushed him because it revealed how little he had truly seen. He had mocked the woman who protected him from becoming someone empty. He had overlooked the one person who never competed with him. And he had confused dominance for strength. Julian stood, unsteady. I'm sorry, he said. The words felt insufficient the moment they left his mouth. Elena didn't respond immediately. Apologies, she knew, were beginnings, not conclusions. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he added. I'm asking for the chance to learn. She studied him. For the first time in years, Julian wasn't performing. He wasn't convincing. He wasn't winning. He was exposed. The deal can be restored, Elena said. In time. Julian shook his head. That's not what matters. She allowed a small pause. Good, she said. That night, Julian sat alone in the dark, replaying moments he once dismissed. Her silence, her patience, her restraint. He saw now that strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. And truth doesn't rise with noise. It stands, unmoving, unavoidable. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't ask permission to be heard. The days after truth surfaced felt different. Not louder, not dramatic. Different in weight. Julian moved through his world more slowly now. The same halls, the same office, the same city skyline beyond the glass. But something essential had shifted. For the first time in his life, success no longer shielded him from reflection. Meetings resumed, but his voice had changed. Fewer declarations, more listening, less certainty, more consideration. People noticed. They didn't say anything, but they noticed. And Elena noticed most of all. She didn't rush him toward reassurance. She didn't comfort his discomfort or soften the reality for him. She had spent too long doing that already. Instead, she gave him space. Not distance, space. The kind that allows a person to either grow or retreat. Julian chose neither at first. He existed in between. He woke early and walked alone through the quiet streets near their home. He revisited conversations in his mind, the jokes he once dismissed, the glances he ignored, the moments where Elena had been present and unseen. He understood now that harm doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives politely, repeatedly, wrapped in humor and confidence. And because it doesn't look violent, it's easy to excuse. Until it isn't. One evening, Julian found Elena in the kitchen, preparing tea. The room was calm, the windows open, the air gentle. He stood there for a moment before speaking. I used to believe leadership meant being the strongest voice in the room, he said. Elena didn't turn around. She listened. I thought certainty was strength. That hesitation meant weakness. She placed 2 cups on the counter. And now? She asked. Now I realize strength is restraint, he replied. And respect is listening without needing control. Elena turned then. She studied him carefully, not searching for perfection, but for sincerity. You can understand something, she said, and still struggle to live it. Julian nodded. I know. They sat together, not touching, not distant, present. Days turned into weeks. Julian did something unfamiliar. He asked questions, not the kind meant to impress, but the kind meant to understand, about Elena's work, about her values, about the trust she had inherited, and the responsibility she carried quietly for years. She told him, not everything at once, but honestly. She spoke about her grandmother's belief that wealth should move silently, doing its work without demanding recognition, about how power, when used loudly, often weakens its own purpose. Julian listened. No interruptions, no corrections, no comparisons. He began to see Elena fully, not as contrast to his world, but as its balance. And with that came grief. For the years he had overlooked her, for the intimacy he had thinned with ego, for the partnership he had delayed by assuming authority. I don't expect you to trust me again quickly, he told her one night. Or at all, if that's what you decide. Elena considered his words. Trust, she said, isn't restored through promises. It's rebuilt through consistency. I'm willing, he replied. She nodded. Then start there. They began again, not as newlyweds, but as equals learning how to meet in the middle. Julian stopped introducing Elena with qualifiers. He spoke her name with pride, not explanation. At dinners, he deferred to her insight, not performatively, naturally. When she spoke, he listened. And when she chose silence, it was no longer assumed to be absence. Slowly, something softened. Not just in Julian, in the space between them. One evening, months later, they stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights below shimmered, distant and quiet. Julian broke the silence. I used to think love meant being admired, he said. Now I know it means being accountable. Elena leaned slightly against the railing. And I used to think patience meant endurance, she replied. Now I know patience without boundaries becomes erasure. They shared a small smile, not because everything was fixed, but because something real had begun. Their marriage didn't survive because truth crushed him. It survived because humility rebuilt him. And Elena? She didn't win. She stood. That was the difference. Moral and life lessons. This story isn't about wealth. It's about perception, about how easily we mistake loudness for leadership, control for care, silence for weakness. It's about how love fails not from hatred, but from neglect, from assuming the other person will always bend. Quiet strength doesn't beg to be seen, but it should never be ignored. And respect. Respect is not admiration, it's acknowledgement. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel small, remember this. You don't need to become louder to be powerful. You don't need to dominate to be valued. And you don't need to shrink to be loved. Sometimes, the most life-changing moment arrives without noise. It arrives when truth finally stands still. If this story moved you, like the video, it helps these messages reach more hearts. Comment below. Do you believe love can survive once pride falls away? And subscribe to Lord of Hearts for more powerful stories about love, growth, and the quiet strength that changes lives.